President Trump tonight is threatening to take action against Nigeria for what he says is the persecution and killing of Christians.
They're killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria, and they have other countries very bad also. You know that part of the world very bad. They're killing the Christians and killing them in very large numbers. We're not going to allow that to happen.
Nigeria is suddenly center stage in a global drama, and it's not a role it asked for. When US President Donald Trump threatened Nigeria with military action unless it dealt faster with what he called the mass killing of Christians, he wasn't just attacking a government. He was challenging the idea that an African power can act in its own interest without looking over its shoulder. This moment is about more than security. It's about sovereignty. It's about whether African nations can handle their own crises, or whether the world will step in, pipes and all, with its own ideas. And for Nigeria, the message is loud. We're watching you. Behave accordingly, or we'll step in. Let's tear this apart. First, the stakes. The violence in Nigeria is horrific, no question. Farmers, herders, villages, communities all over the Middle Belt and North are being attacked, kidnapped, destroyed. Christians, Muslims, young, old, no one is spared. Analysts say the majority of victims of groups like Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, are Muslims simply because those groups operate in Muslim-majority regions. Yet in his post on social media, Trump framed the narrative like this: Christians face an existential threat in Nigeria. Thousands are being killed by radical Islamists. It's a strong narrative. It simplifies, it mobilizes, it attracts attention. But here's the rub. When a powerful outsider gets to define your crisis in this way, the consequences aren't just diplomatic, they're structural. Nigeria's government responded quickly. President Bola Tinubu's office declared that Nigeria is not religiously intolerant, pointed out constitutional protections for all faiths, and warned that the narrative being built doesn't reflect the national reality. They welcomed US assistance, but only if Nigeria's territorial integrity and sovereignty are respected. That's the first major tilt in this story. Sovereignty asserted. Now let's define our terms. Sovereignty, the right of a state to govern itself, determine its own policies, act on its own behalf, free from external coercion or dictates. Intervention, when a foreign power enters another state's affairs, militarily, politically, economically, often claiming moral justification. When a foreign leader posts, "We'll attack if you don't comply," you are firmly in the territory of intervention. The question is, how does a sovereign nation respond without surrendering the field? Here's a second tilt in this story: narrative control. Who gets to describe what's happening? Who decides the language? Because language frames action. A genocide demands one kind of response. A security crisis demands another. If Nigeria is labeled systematically killing Christians, then foreign powers feel justified handing down ultimatums or moving boots on the ground. But if it's described as complex insurgency, communal violence, herder-farmer conflict, the response becomes internal reforms, local courts, regional cooperation. In other words make worlds. It's here we see why Nigeria's assertion of sovereignty matters so much. Because if Nigeria accepts the label dictated from outside, it also accepts the script of outside intervention. That's not just about aid or advice, it's about power. And guess what? External powers love that script. Because intervention is cheaper than enabling self-governance. It's easier to parachute in with bombs or sanctions or grand speeches than to help rebuild a state from within. Third leg of the tripod, responsibility. Nigeria is under no illusions. It knows there are serious problems: weak security, corruption, poverty, and a state still recovering from decades of instability. Some communities feel abandoned. Some victims cry for justice. The chain of impunity is long. From an African perspective, here's what we insist on. Nigeria must own its mistakes and fix them. But on its own terms. Sovereignty does not mean unaccountability. In fact, the strongest sovereignty comes when a nation holds itself to high standards, invites transparent scrutiny, and acts decisively. So when outside powers hold up a sign saying, "You must fix this or we'll fix you," that weakens sovereignty. It moves the locus of control outside. It shifts from we act for ourselves to someone acts for us. From the Nigerian point of view, sending in foreign troops wouldn't just be a support mission, it would be a takeover of responsibility. Once foreign troops are in your soil, once foreign aid becomes leverage, once external labels dictate internal priorities, you no longer control your own future. This is especially true in Africa's history. Time and time again, we've seen intervention roll in under the banner of humanitarian relief or peacekeeping and leave with data mines, bases, and power centers. The scars of foreign boots linger longer than the explosions. Now let's return to the headline moment, Trump's threat. He called Nigeria a disgraced country. He promised action if the government doesn't move fast. He set conditions. Stop the killing of Christians or face aid cuts and possible military action. For Nigeria, that's a sit-up call. It's not just a rebuke. It's a reminder that in the global power dynamic, African states are still expected to be responsive rather than proactive. But here's the pivot. Nigeria doesn't have to accept that role. Instead, Nigeria can use this moment to assert a new posture, one of partnership, not patronization, one of respect, not subordination. That means saying, yes, we'll work with you, but we'll do it on our terms. It means opening security partnerships, intelligence sharing, even foreign assistance, but refusing to cede control or accept labels that do not reflect the full reality. And it means demanding that international engagement be just, not just morally framed, but practically effective, aligned with Nigerian priorities, and subject to Nigerian oversight. This is a pro-African lens. Africa, not as a theater of foreign policies, but as a partner in its own future. Nigeria's leverage begins with its size, 230 million people, the largest economy on the continent, a country with oil, gas, technology talent, cultural exports, and geopolitical weight that stretches from the Gulf of Guinea to the Sahel. Nigeria isn't just another developing nation. It's a regional anchor, whether it acts like one or not. That's what makes Trump's threat so politically loaded. You don't talk about military action against a power like that unless you're trying to send a message, not just to Nigeria, but to the rest of Africa. Don't get too independent. Because in geopolitical terms, independence isn't just about land or flags. It's about narrative control, resource control, and alliance control. When an African nation starts setting its own diplomatic terms, it makes the big powers uncomfortable, especially one as strategically placed as Nigeria. Here's what many don't see. Nigeria is sitting on one of the most consequential chessboards in the world. To its north, the Sahel, destabilized by extremist networks. To its west, ECOWAS nations struggling to balance democracy and sovereignty under coups and sanctions. To its south, oil-rich coastlines that power much of the global economy. If Nigeria collapses, the shockwaves reach Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. That's why Western interest in Nigeria isn't just moral, it's strategic, and that's the contradiction. Western leaders talk about saving lives, but they're also guarding access to trade routes, to minerals, to influence. When Trump says Christians are being killed, that may sound compassionate to his base, but it's also a convenient moral excuse to project American power into Africa again. It's the oldest trick in the book. Moral justification for geopolitical gain. Libya, Iraq, Syria all followed the same script. We're intervening to protect innocent lives. The result? Decades of instability, proxy wars, and failed states. If Nigeria bows to that pattern, it risks becoming another headline in the long list of countries rescued into ruin. But this time, Africa has a chance to break the loop. Nigeria's response, calm, assertive, and unapologetic, is the model. Not silence, not panic, just clarity. We welcome help, but on our terms. That sentence is the beginning of a new African diplomacy, cooperative, not submissive. The West has long used intervention as both carrot and stick. They sell the idea of partnership, but keep the power imbalance baked into every deal. When aid becomes leverage, sovereignty becomes theater. You wave your flag, but someone else writes your policy. And it's not just the military. Intervention has many faces. It shows up as loans from financial institutions with strings that reshape entire economies. It shows up as development programs designed around donor optics, not local needs. It shows up in media narratives that turn every African crisis into a morality play. That's why Nigeria's defiance matters so much. It's not just about saying no to a potential US strike. It's about reclaiming the right to define context. Because whoever defines the context controls the conversation, and whoever controls the conversation controls the outcome. But sovereignty doesn't survive on pride alone. It needs performance. Nigeria has to prove it can govern itself effectively, because sovereignty without competence is a fragile illusion. If corruption continues to rot the state, if justice remains selective, if insecurity keeps spreading, then foreign intervention will always find justification. That's the uncomfortable truth, and it's also the opportunity. The best defense against foreign pressure is functional governance. When the Nigerian government secures its people, manages its economy, and delivers justice, it shuts down the narrative that outsiders need to save it. That's the real battle, not against the US military, but against internal decay. Still, the way Trump's comments landed shows how power dynamics really work. A single statement from Washington can send shockwaves across African capitals. A single tweet can move markets, spook investors, or trigger diplomatic panic. That imbalance shouldn't exist, but it does. Because the global system is designed to keep Africa reactive. Western nations have the platforms, the media reach, and the financial networks that shape public perception. African nations, on the other hand, often fail to coordinate messaging, allowing others to define their realities. When Western outlets say Nigeria is on the brink of genocide, that becomes the truth by repetition, even when it's an oversimplification. This is where Nigeria must get smarter. Information is power, and today, global influence runs not on armies but on narratives. Nigeria needs a strategic communications policy, one that tells its own story, with data, with transparency, and with confidence. That means briefing international journalists, inviting independent investigations, and countering disinformation in real time. When you tell your own story well, you don't have to beg others to believe you. At the same time, Africa's collective voice has to grow louder. The African Union and regional powers should be speaking in one chorus on this issue. No foreign intervention without African consensus. That's how Europe protects itself. That's how Asia does it. Why shouldn't Africa? Intervention isn't always military. Sometimes it's psychological. When African leaders start second-guessing their own authority because of Western disapproval, that's already intervention at work. Trump's words were more than a threat, they were a test. Would Nigeria panic, apologize, or push back? Nigeria pushed back, diplomatically but firmly. That's how sovereignty looks in the 21st century. Not isolationist, but assertive. You don't burn bridges, but you don't crawl across them either. And here's the nuance most commentators miss. Rejecting Western interference doesn't mean rejecting Western cooperation. It means redefining it. It means partnerships based on equality, not dependency. Because real partnership is when you can say no and still sit at the table. The Western world needs to understand that modern Africa isn't looking for saviors. It's looking for respect. Africans know their nations have flaws. They also know those flaws don't make them inferior. They make them human. What they reject is the double standard, that Western nations get to make mistakes and call them policy, while African nations make mistakes and get called failed states. Nigeria's sit-up call to the West isn't a tantrum. It's a statement of maturity. For decades, Western foreign policy toward Africa has been built on two assumptions: that African governments can't be trusted to manage their affairs, and that Western intervention is inherently benevolent. Both assumptions are collapsing. Africa's new generation, politically awake, digitally connected, and globally literate, isn't buying the savior narrative anymore. They see through it. They understand how foreign interests operate, through moral posturing, backed by hard strategy. So when Trump threatens military action, it doesn't inspire fear, it inspires clarity. It shows Africans exactly how little sovereignty they truly have, and how urgently they must protect it. This is the turning point. Nigeria standing up and saying, "We hear your concern, but we'll handle our own house." It's not anti-West. It's pro-Nigeria, and by extension, pro-Africa. Because the truth is, sovereignty and intervention have never peacefully coexisted. One has to give way to the other. The stronger Nigeria becomes at home, the less justification exists for anyone abroad to help. That's where the real battle is, not on the ground, but in the mindset. Africa has to stop asking for validation and start demanding parity, because until that happens, every crisis will be an open door for someone else's agenda. Nigeria's diplomatic stance right now isn't just a reaction. It's an inflection point. The way it handles this clash with Washington will echo far beyond its borders. Because this isn't just about Nigeria being targeted by a Western president. It's about whether Africa's largest democracy can step into a new role. Not the continent's victim, but its voice. Let's be honest. The West doesn't fear a weak Africa. It fears a united one. A divided Africa is predictable, manageable, easy to manipulate through aid and influence. But a confident Africa, capable of defending its interests and questioning global double standards. That's the nightmare scenario for those who've built decades of policy on the assumption that Africa will always need supervision. Nigeria is big enough, vocal enough, and complex enough to shatter that assumption. If it plays its cards right, this crisis could become its diplomatic awakening. For decades, Nigeria has tried to balance being the regional big brother while managing its own internal dysfunction. Its foreign policy has often been cautious, a mix of moral leadership and quiet pragmatism. But this moment calls for something bolder, a redefinition of what African sovereignty means in a multipolar world. Because we're no longer living in a world where the West holds all the keys. China, Russia, Turkey, India, all are deepening their footprints across Africa. But replacing one external dependency with another isn't liberation, it's rotation. True sovereignty means building internal strength that allows partnership without submission, cooperation without control. And that starts with narrative power. The West still dominates how African crises are told. Every report, every headline, every think tank paper filters Africa's reality through Western lenses, moral, political, and economic. It's not always malicious, but it's always limiting. When Trump framed the killings in Nigeria as a Christian genocide, he wasn't citing intelligence reports or ground investigations. He was repeating talking points crafted for Western domestic politics. It's a strategy: appeal to evangelical voters, weaponize global outrage, and paint yourself as the defender of faith. It's not about Nigeria. It's about optics. The tragedy is that such rhetoric dehumanizes Nigerians. It turns real suffering into political currency. And that's why Nigeria's response must be strategic, not emotional. The first step is transparency. The Nigerian government needs to open its doors to credible, independent investigations into the violence. Not because Washington demanded it, but because its own people deserve the truth. When your own data speaks louder than foreign accusations, you own the story. Second, diplomacy. Smart, assertive, and coordinated. Nigeria must rally African allies to issue a joint declaration rejecting any unilateral military threats from foreign powers. ECOWAS, the African Union, and the UN African Group should present a unified stance, respect our sovereignty, or risk losing legitimacy in African affairs. Because the question isn't whether Western powers can act, it's whether they should. And if Africa doesn't set boundaries, nobody else will. The third step is domestic repair. You can't demand respect externally while rotting internally. Every insecurity, every corruption scandal, every unpunished massacre becomes ammunition for interventionists. If Nigeria's leadership wants to silence foreign threats, it has to show it's capable of protecting its citizens and delivering justice. That's not just governance, that's national defense. And let's talk about the African street, the people watching all this unfold. The younger generation isn't buying the savior complex anymore. They've grown up online, seen how propaganda works, how Western governments use democracy promotion as cover for geopolitical engineering. They remember Libya. They see the hypocrisy of preaching freedom abroad while fueling instability with arms sales and exploitative trade deals. This generation wants something different. not isolation, but dignity. They want their nations to stand tall, speak truth to power, and stop playing the perpetual underdog in the global story. And Nigeria, whether it likes it or not, has the credibility and scale to lead that cultural shift. Because this isn't just a diplomatic standoff, it's a test of African self-respect. Can Africa stand up to a sitting US president without collapsing into fear or outrage? Can it answer power with principle? What makes this moment so critical is that the world is watching. Every country in the global south, from Brazil to Indonesia, is observing how Africa responds. Because everyone understands this, sovereignty in the 21st century is no longer defended with armies alone. It's defended with coherence, political coherence, narrative coherence, moral coherence. And that coherence begins with leadership that knows when to say no and when to say let's talk. The West loves to present intervention as humanitarian necessity, but the record is damning. Interventions have left Libya fragmented, Afghanistan broken, Iraq destabilized. Each time the script begins with noble language and ends with chaos. If that's the cost of saving a nation, Nigeria is right to refuse. But refusal alone isn't enough. Sovereignty is a responsibility. You earn it every day by serving your citizens. That means Nigeria must move beyond reaction and into reinvention, reforming its justice system, decentralizing power, investing in communities vulnerable to insurgent recruitment. When you strengthen your people, you eliminate the vacuum outsiders exploit. And Africa, as a continent, must learn to institutionalize that independence, create African monitoring bodies for human rights and conflict verification, build African crisis response forces that can handle regional threats without waiting for Western assistance. That's what real sovereignty looks like. Not isolationism, but interdependence built from within the continent, not imposed from without. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: the West only intervenes where it sees weakness. It never sends troops where a country has strong governance, strong institutions, and a united people. Power respects power, even when it disagrees with it. That's the signal Nigeria must send now. The message isn't "we don't need you," it's "we'll decide how to work with you." And that's a line Africa hasn't drawn clearly enough. For too long, Western governments have been allowed to treat African nations like case studies, subjects of moral experiments. The time has come for Africa to become the author, not the object. What Trump's outburst revealed, unintentionally, is how fragile Western moral authority has become. When a president uses the threat of airstrikes as humanitarian leverage, it exposes how quickly compassion turns into coercion. It proves that the rhetoric of values often hides the agenda of dominance. And that's exactly why Nigeria's restraint is so important. Instead of shouting, it stood firm. Instead of folding, it clarified. That's diplomacy as strength, not weakness. The real challenge now is consistency. Nigeria can't demand respect abroad and neglect justice at home. It can't reject American intervention while ignoring domestic inequality. Sovereignty without service becomes hypocrisy. But if Nigeria rises to that challenge, if it uses this moment to clean its own house while defending its independence, then it won't just survive the storm. It will set a precedent for the entire continent, because every African capital watching this episode is silently taking notes. If Nigeria can stand its ground against the world's most powerful nation and still command dialogue, it shifts the entire balance of post-colonial diplomacy. And that's why this is bigger than Nigeria. It's about the rebirth of African confidence. A new chapter where nations no longer flinch when the West raises its voice, but instead meet power with purpose. That's what sovereignty looks like in this century. Composed, assertive, principled. Not shouting, "we don't need you," but calmly saying, "we'll decide how this story goes." Because the days of outsiders writing Africa's headlines are ending, the question is, who's ready to write the next ones?